It was October 1998, and I was 32 years old. I'd taken a week off from work to spend time in the woods near northern Montana, where I'd been hunting most of my life. The cabin I stayed in belonged to an old friend who moved out of state years ago. It sat deep in the pines, nearly 20 miles from the closest paved road, surrounded by uneven terrain and thick forest. The place had no electricity and only a hand pump for water out back. I liked it that way, quiet, cut off, no interruptions. I drove up in my old pickup early in the morning, leaving the main road behind as I turned onto a narrow dirt track that wound through endless trees. The air got colder and sharper the deeper I went. The forest on both sides looked dark and wet, branches heavy with frost even though the sun hadn't fully risen. I reached the cabin around mid-morning, the tires crunching over gravel as I pulled into the small clearing. It was the same as I remembered, a small, weathered log structure with a tin roof that rattled in the wind and a stack of split wood leaning against the wall. I unloaded my gear, a .308 rifle, a cooler full of supplies, a lantern, and a sleeping bag. Inside, the cabin smelled like old wood smoke and dust. The single window let in a narrow beam of light, catching the fine particles drifting in the air. The furniture was simple: one cot, a wooden table, 2 chairs, and an old stove in the corner that looked like it hadn't been used in years. The first day went as planned. I hiked out before noon and scouted the nearby ridge where deer often passed through. I found tracks, fresh ones, probably from that morning, and made note of the direction. The woods were dead quiet, except for the occasional creak of branches or distant crack of ice breaking on a creek. By evening, I'd seen nothing worth taking a shot at, so I headed back to the cabin. The light was fading fast, and the wind had started to pick up, whispering through the pines in a low, steady moan. That night, I sat on the small porch, eating canned beans by the light of my lantern. The cold bit through my jacket, and I could see my breath drifting in the air. There was something about that kind of silence that got into your head. No cars, no voices, not even the sound of distant planes. Just the steady hum of the forest, like it was alive but hiding something. I turned in early, locking the door behind me, and drifted off to sleep listening to the wind scrape against the walls. Sometime after midnight, I woke up to a faint sound. It wasn't the wind. It was softer, slower, like something brushing against the outer wall near the window. I lay still for a moment, listening. It stopped. I told myself it was probably a branch, maybe an animal nosing around. The woods were full of raccoons, foxes, and sometimes even coyotes that wandered close looking for scraps. I rolled over, pulled the blanket tighter, and went back to sleep. The next morning was gray and still. Frost covered the ground outside, crunching under my boots as I stepped out. I walked around the cabin to check for tracks and froze when I saw them. They weren't animal prints. They were boot prints, human. They circled around the cabin and stopped right below the window beside my cot. I crouched down and studied them, size 11 or 12, deep in the frost like someone had been standing there a while. My first thought was that maybe a hunter had gotten lost, maybe wandered through the night. But the prints only led up to the cabin. There were no tracks leading away. I followed them around to the back, where they stopped near the tree line. Nothing beyond that, just quiet woods stretching out into the cold distance. The whole thing felt off. Still, I tried not to overthink it. I'd been in these woods enough to know that weird things happened out here. Things you couldn't always explain right away. I figured maybe the frost or the light played tricks on the prints. I brushed it off and went about my day. That afternoon I hiked farther out, about 3 miles north, where the forest grew thicker. The ground there was uneven and muddy, and I noticed more tracks, deer mostly, but one set of prints caught my eye again. They were human, same size as the ones near the cabin, leading off into the woods before vanishing on the hard ground. Whoever it was, they'd been moving quietly, carefully. I didn't see anyone, though. just that heavy silence pressing down between the trees. When I got back near dusk, the light was low and blue, and I saw something that stopped me cold. The door to the cabin was open. I knew for a fact I'd locked it before leaving. My stomach tightened as I stepped closer. The door swung slightly in the wind, creaking at the hinges. I raised my rifle, though I didn't expect to use it, and stepped inside. Everything looked untouched at first, the cot, the table, the cooler. But the lantern on the table was moved. It had been sitting on the left side before. Now it was on the right. I looked closer and saw something else. Mud on the floor. A single boot print near the door. I checked my pack, my food, my rifle case. Nothing was missing. Whoever had been inside hadn't taken anything. They just came in, looked around, and left. I didn't sleep that night. I sat up with the lantern low, staring at the door and listening. Around 2 in the morning, I heard movement again. Slow, steady steps outside. This time I didn't move. I just sat there, barely breathing. The steps circled the cabin once, then stopped right outside the wall by the window again. I could hear faint breathing, or maybe it was the wind pressing against the wood. Minutes passed like hours before the sound faded away into the distance. When dawn broke, I stepped outside and found the same thing as before. Fresh prints in the frost, stopping right below the window. The ground beyond was smooth, untouched. I knew then that someone was watching the cabin, maybe waiting for me to leave. The woods stretched for miles, no cell service, no one nearby. If something happened out there, nobody would know. By midday, I made my decision. I packed up what I could carry, loaded my rifle, and started walking toward where the dirt road began. I kept my eyes open the whole way, checking behind me every few minutes. The forest was too quiet again. No birds, no wind, just that cold stillness. After nearly an hour of walking, I saw something move between the trees, just a flicker of dark clothing about 50 yards away. I froze, watching. It wasn't an animal. Someone was standing there, half hidden, facing my direction. I didn't call out. I just kept walking, faster this time, pretending not to see. Every few minutes I glanced back, but whoever it was didn't follow. I finally reached my truck in the late afternoon. There were more tracks near it, same boots, circling once before stopping at the driver's side door. My keys were still in my pocket, but I could feel my pulse hammering as I unlocked it and got in. The whole time, I felt like someone was just behind the trees, watching me leave. When I finally reached the highway and stopped at a gas station miles away, I sat in the cab for a while, trying to calm down. My hands were shaking, and I couldn't shake the image of those footprints under the window. Whoever that was out there hadn't tried to rob me. They hadn't said anything or made any move to attack. They just watched for 2 nights straight. A few days later, I told the local ranger what had happened. He said there had been reports over the past month of a man wandering those woods, living rough, maybe squatting in old cabins. They hadn't caught him. He said they'd checked the area, but they never found anything. No tent, no campfire, no tracks by the time they got there. I never went back to that cabin after that. I sold my rifle the next spring and stopped hunting altogether. The woods didn't feel the same anymore. Sometimes late at night, when the wind hits my house just right, I think about that sound against the wall, that slow, careful movement. It wasn't a ghost or some made-up story. It was real. Someone was out there, watching me breathe, just a few feet away from where I slept. And the part that still sticks with me, after all these years, is knowing they never left a trace of where they went after that last night. The prints stopped at the tree line and disappeared, like they were still out there somewhere, waiting for the next light in the woods to appear. It was the fall of 1998 when I decided to stay alone in the old cabin behind St. Rainer Cemetery. I was 28 at the time, and I had taken a short leave from work to clear my head after a bad stretch of months. The cabin belonged to my uncle, who had passed years earlier, and no one in the family ever bothered to visit it. It sat about half a mile from the back edge of the cemetery, tucked between tall spruce trees and patches of overgrown weeds. I had always remembered it as a quiet, lonely place, but it felt like exactly what I needed then: isolation and silence. The drive there took most of the afternoon. The narrow road turned to gravel a few miles out of town, and the further I went, the more it felt like I was slipping out of the world. I remember passing the old cemetery gates. The black iron bent slightly, half the letters of the sign rusted off. Beyond it, white and gray stones jutted from the uneven ground like crooked teeth, some leaning, others nearly buried under thick layers of moss. The cabin was a short drive past that, hidden behind a cluster of dark pine trees that almost touched each other overhead. When I parked, the air was still. No wind, no sound of birds. Even the trees seemed stiff, unmoving. The cabin stood exactly as I remembered it. Small, one-story, with the same warped wood and rusted tin roof. The porch steps sagged under my boots as I climbed up. The door creaked open stiffly, the hinges moaning like they hadn't been moved in years. Inside, everything smelled of damp wood and old dust. Cobwebs hung from the corners, and the air carried that faint sour smell that old buildings collect when left alone too long. There were only 2 rooms, one main room with a small kitchen counter and a wood stove, and a smaller back room with a single bed and a broken dresser. The mattress was old, but I had brought a sleeping bag, so I didn't mind. I opened the windows to let some air through, but the breeze barely moved. The woods outside seemed frozen in their own silence. That first night was uneventful, though sleep didn't come easily. The air was cold, and every creak of the wood made me open my eyes again. Around midnight, I heard what sounded like soft thuds from outside, like something heavy pressing against the ground, moving slowly. I tried to tell myself it was just a deer or maybe a branch falling, but it didn't sound like that. The sound came in intervals: step, pause, step. After a few minutes, it stopped. The next morning, I went outside and looked around the cabin. The ground was soft from the rain the night before, and I noticed faint impressions in the dirt. They weren't clear footprints, but there were marks, uneven, deep, like someone had been dragging something heavy. They led from the tree line to the edge of the cabin and then vanished near the back door. I crouched down, tracing one with my fingers. It felt strange, as if the soil had been pressed by something hard. I brushed it off as an animal, maybe a wild boar or something, though deep down I didn't fully believe that. I decided to take a walk to the cemetery later that afternoon. The path there was narrow, half covered in weeds. The cemetery itself stretched wider than I remembered. Most of the graves were old, from the 1800s or early 1900s, with faded engravings. Some were cracked, others half-sunk. I wandered between them for a while, running my hand over cold stone, feeling the dampness of the moss that clung to everything. It was silent except for the faint rustling of dry grass. In one far corner, I noticed a newer grave, the dirt still loose, the flowers wilted but not completely dead. I didn't recognize the name carved into it. The date said the burial had been only 2 weeks earlier. That night, I built a small fire in the stove. The warmth helped, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the woods outside were too still. Around 10, I heard it again, the sound of steps outside. Not hurried, just slow, deliberate. I turned off the lantern, letting the darkness fill the room. I sat still, listening. The steps moved around the cabin, circling it once, then stopping near the back. My heartbeat felt heavy in my chest. I waited. Then I heard a dull scraping sound, like something hard brushing against wood. It lasted a few seconds, then silence again. When morning came, I checked the back wall. There were faint scratches along the wood, small, not deep, but fresh. The bark and dirt near the back window were disturbed again, the same as before. I started to feel uneasy. On the third day, I drove into the nearest town, a place called West Mill, just to buy some supplies and maybe see people again. The man at the small grocery store mentioned that no one really went near St. Rainer Cemetery anymore. He said there had been an accident a couple of weeks ago. A grave digger had fallen into one of the old open plots during a storm. They didn't find him for a day. He laughed a little when he said it, like it was an old local story. I didn't laugh. When I got back to the cabin that evening, the air felt heavier. It wasn't just cold. It carried that thick, earthy smell like wet soil and rot, the kind that sticks to your clothes. The firewood was damp, but I managed to get the stove going again. I didn't want to think about the noises anymore. I tried reading, then writing in the old notebook I'd brought, but I couldn't focus. I kept glancing at the window, half expecting to see something moving in the dark. Around midnight, I woke to a faint thump, then another. It was right against the wall beside the bed. I sat up, heart pounding. The thumping grew sharper, not random this time, but steady. I could hear the dirt shifting outside, faint crunches of dry leaves. It lasted maybe a minute, then stopped. I didn't sleep again that night. When dawn came, I went outside immediately. The ground was torn up along the back of the cabin, like someone had been digging there. A patch of earth near the window looked freshly disturbed. I grabbed a shovel from the shed and started turning the dirt. I don't even know why I did it. Maybe I needed to prove something to myself. The soil was soft, darker than the rest. After a few minutes of digging, the smell hit me. That thick, sickly sweet smell of decay. I stopped instantly, my stomach twisting. A few inches down, something pale showed through the dirt. I dropped the shovel. It looked like fabric, maybe part of a shirt sleeve, mud-stained and torn. I backed away, staring at the ground. The pieces began to connect. The new grave at the cemetery, the dragging marks, the digging sounds. My chest felt tight, my head light. I went inside, packed my bag as quickly as I could, and didn't look back. The drive out felt longer than when I came. Every turn of the tires sounded too loud, every tree too close. When I reached the main road, I stopped to breathe for a moment. My hands were shaking, and my nails were still lined with dirt from digging. A week later, I called the local sheriff's office anonymously and told them to check behind the cabin near St. Rainer Cemetery. I didn't give my name or number. I never went back, and I never found out what they discovered. Though a month later, I read a short piece in a local paper about human remains found behind an old property near the cemetery. No details were released, just that it appeared to be connected to a previous burial accident. Sometimes, I still see that place in my mind. The thin trees, the pale gravestones under the fog, the shape of the cabin standing like a shadow among them. I can still smell the damp earth and that faint, sweet rot. I've tried to convince myself it was just an unlucky coincidence, that maybe the old grave digger had been buried in the wrong spot, or that the ground shifted. But I remember how those marks looked in the dirt, how something had been dragged, how it circled the cabin night after night. I've moved twice since then. I keep my windows locked now, even in the summer. And sometimes, when the night is very quiet, I swear I can still hear that soft, heavy sound. Step, pause, step, moving slowly through the dirt outside. It had been 5 years since my ex-husband, Mark, passed away. Sometimes it still didn't feel real. He died in a car accident on a back road near his family's cabin, the same one we used to visit during the early years of our marriage. That cabin had been the only place where he seemed calm, away from work, away from people. After he died, his sister told me he'd spent most weekends there alone. I hadn't been back since we split, but a few weeks ago, I found out that the land was finally being cleared for sale, and his family wanted me to go through what was left inside before it was demolished. They said there might be a few of my things still there, and maybe some personal items that belonged to him that I'd want to keep. It was early October when I decided to go. The weather was gray and heavy, the kind that made you feel like something was pressing down on you. The drive from my town to the cabin took about 3 hours. The roads were narrow and quiet, surrounded by endless pine trees that never seemed to end. I remember thinking how familiar it all felt. I used to know every curve in those roads, every patch of dirt where Mark would pull over to check the tires or smoke a cigarette. The air smelled the same, wet pine, old soil, and that faint metallic scent that comes before rain. The cabin sat at the end of a long gravel path that cut through thick woods. It wasn't big, just a one-bedroom wooden structure with a rusted metal roof and a small porch that looked like it could collapse under its own weight. I parked my car beside it and just sat there for a moment, staring at the windows. Most of them were covered in grime, but one curtain inside was slightly open, as if someone had been there not too long ago. I knew that wasn't possible. Mark was gone, and his family had said nobody had visited in years. But the thought stayed in my mind as I stepped out of the car. The first thing I noticed when I unlocked the door was the smell. It was a mix of dust, mildew, and something faintly sour, like rotting wood. The air was stale, heavy with stillness. I flipped the switch near the door, but the power had been cut long ago. Light from the cloudy sky slipped through the cracks between the curtains, giving the room a dim, cold glow. The furniture was exactly how I remembered it. An old couch with a tear along the armrest, a small table with coffee rings that never came off, and the stone fireplace where Mark used to sit late at night staring at the flames. His boots were still beside it, laces untied, the leather cracked with age. It was strange seeing them there, as if he had just taken them off and gone outside for a minute. I started going through the drawers and boxes scattered around the main room. Most of it was junk, old receipts, fishing hooks, empty bottles, faded photographs of hunting trips. I found one box filled with my old books, the ones I'd left behind when I moved out. The sight of my handwriting inside one of them made my stomach twist. I sat down for a bit, trying to steady myself. The silence in that place wasn't peaceful. It was thick, almost alive. Every creak of the floor sounded sharper than it should have been. I tried to ignore it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been there more recently than they should have. The fridge, though unplugged, had fresh fingerprints on the handle. There was a blanket on the couch that looked too clean compared to the rest of the cabin. I told myself that maybe a relative had stopped by months ago and left it, but the thought didn't calm me. I decided to check the back of the cabin, where Mark used to keep tools and supplies. The small shed behind the cabin was half collapsed. When I pulled open the door, a pile of damp wood and rusted nails spilled out. Inside, there was a stack of firewood, a chainsaw, and a few old gas cans. Everything smelled like oil and mold. Then I noticed something that stopped me. There was a trail of footprints in the dirt behind the shed, boot prints, larger than mine, heading toward the tree line. They looked fresh, edges still sharp, like they had been made recently. I crouched down and touched one of them. The soil was still soft and slightly damp, and when I pulled my fingers back, they were cold. A part of me wanted to believe they were old prints that had just held their shape, but deep down I knew better. The pattern on the soles looked familiar. Mark used to wear a pair of heavy hiking boots with a deep tread like that. I looked back at the pair near the fireplace. They were still there, untouched and dusty. I felt my heartbeat rising in my chest. I didn't want to panic, but I could feel something was wrong. The forest around the cabin was too quiet. No wind, no birds, no rustling. I could hear my own breathing and the faint hum of blood in my ears. I turned back toward the cabin, suddenly aware of how far I'd walked from it. When I got back inside, I locked the door behind me. I told myself I'd finish packing what I needed and leave before it got dark. but my hands were shaking as I picked through the rest of the boxes. There was one small metal box under the bed, the kind that locked with a tiny key. It wasn't dusty like everything else. I pried it open with a screwdriver from the kitchen drawer. Inside were a few things: a folded piece of paper, a small photograph of Mark standing in front of the cabin, and a driver's license that wasn't his. The license belonged to a man named James Collins. I didn't recognize the face, but the issue date was from 2 years after Mark died. My stomach dropped. I couldn't understand why that would be here. Maybe someone had been living here, squatting after the family stopped coming. But then who was this man, and why were his things mixed with Mark's? I checked the rest of the cabin more carefully. In the closet, there were newer clothes, men's clothes, jeans, flannel shirts, a heavy jacket that still smelled faintly like sweat and would smoke. The toothbrush in the bathroom was also new, the kind they didn't even sell back when Mark was alive. Someone had been here, and recently, it was starting to get dark. I stepped outside to make sure my car was still there, half expecting it to be gone. It was still parked, but the air felt different, colder, heavier. The trees seemed darker, their shapes blending into the shadows. I didn't stay out long. I went back in, grabbed my bag, and packed up everything that looked like it might belong to me. Before I left, I looked around one last time. The cabin was silent again, but that feeling of being watched hadn't gone away. I double-checked the front door, turned off the lantern, and stepped outside. I could see my own breath in the air. As I walked toward the car, I noticed something faint on the ground by the steps. Muddy footprints, the same boot prints I had seen behind the shed. But this time, they were facing toward the cabin, not away from it. I got into my car and started the engine immediately. The sound of it breaking the silence was almost too loud. I didn't look back at the cabin as I drove down the gravel path. I just kept going until I hit the main road. My hands were stiff on the steering wheel, and my chest felt tight. When I got home later that night, I unpacked the small metal box and set it on my kitchen table. I couldn't stop thinking about that license. I searched the name online. There were a few results, one small article from 3 years ago about a missing hiker named James Collins. He had last been seen near a forested area about 20 miles from where the cabin stood. They never found him. That was when it all fit together. Someone had been living there after Mark died. Maybe it was this James guy, maybe he wandered in, found the place abandoned, and stayed. But then something happened. Maybe he went out into the woods one night and never came back. Maybe those prints were his, not old but new, made by someone still moving around that place. The thought stuck with me for days. I didn't tell Mark's family what I found. I just mailed them the cabin keys and said I'd taken what I needed. The land would be cleared soon, and the cabin would be gone. But sometimes, when it rains and I can't sleep, I still think about that place, about those footprints that led both away from and back toward the cabin, about the man who might have stayed there long after Mark was gone. I wonder if he ever made it out of those woods, or if he's still out there somewhere, walking the same paths that Mark once did, disappearing into that quiet, endless dark. It was late September of 2013 when I decided to take a short break from everything and spend a weekend at a small cabin I'd rented online. The cabin was in a rural area in northern Montana, about 3 hours from where I lived in Great Falls. I'd been working long hours at a construction job, and I just needed a few days away from the noise, the dust, and the constant ringing of my phone. The idea of quiet, trees, and cold mountain air sounded perfect. The cabin was listed as being remote but accessible, sitting near the edge of a wide patch of forest with a narrow gravel road leading to it. When I arrived that Friday afternoon, I realized remote was an understatement. The last 10 miles of the drive were nothing but winding dirt roads cutting through thick woods, with no phone signal and barely any signs of life except a few scattered mailboxes at crossroads that looked like they hadn't been checked in years. The sun was already low when I reached the cabin, and the orange light from the west stretched long shadows across the clearing. The cabin itself was small, made of dark, weathered wood, and stood near a slope that led down to a creek. The front porch had a broken rocking chair, a rusted lantern, and a few empty beer bottles left by whoever stayed there last. The inside smelled faintly of pine and dust. It had a single room with a small kitchen area, a table, a bed, and a wood stove. Everything looked old but functional. The rental owner had left a note on the table with a few instructions. There was no running water, the generator was in the shed, and to watch out for wildlife because bears were common in the area. That first evening was quiet. I unpacked my bag, lit the stove, and made some canned soup. As the night grew darker, I realized just how silent the place was. There wasn't the distant hum of cars or any sound of people. The only thing I could hear was the soft rustling of trees outside and the occasional crack from the wood in the stove. I went to bed around 9, tired from the long drive. Sometime around midnight, I woke up to a dull thump from outside. It wasn't loud, but in that deep silence, it stood out sharply. I thought maybe an animal had knocked something over, so I stayed still, listening. A few seconds later, I heard another sound, like footsteps on the porch, slow and heavy, one after another. My heart started beating fast. I reached for my flashlight on the floor beside the bed and aimed it at the front window. The light cut through the room, but all I could see through the glass was darkness and faint shapes of the trees. I kept listening. The footsteps stopped. I waited for what felt like several minutes, but there was nothing else. I tried to calm myself, telling myself it was probably just a deer or maybe the wind shifting something. Still, I didn't sleep much the rest of that night. In the morning, I checked outside. The grass around the porch was damp from dew, and I noticed prints in the soft dirt. Boot prints, not animal tracks. They led from the edge of the trees to the steps and then back again. That bothered me. They weren't mine. They were larger and fresher than when I had arrived. I didn't have cell service, but I had brought a small handheld radio for emergencies, though it only worked on local weather channels. I tried not to overthink it. Maybe a hunter had passed through or someone hiking nearby. Still, the feeling of being watched lingered. That day, I tried to distract myself. I walked to the creek, collected some firewood, and took a few photos of the area with my camera. The forest was beautiful in a rough, lonely way. The air was sharp with the smell of pine, and the water from the creek was clear and cold. When I got back to the cabin in the late afternoon, I noticed something strange. The front door was slightly open. I was sure I had closed it before leaving. Inside, everything looked the same except for one thing. My backpack, which I had left on the chair, was now on the floor near the bed. Nothing seemed missing, but that was enough to make my stomach tighten. I locked the door and checked the windows. All of them were shut tight. I couldn't figure out if someone had actually been there or if I'd just been careless, but I couldn't shake the unease that had started to build. That night, I kept the flashlight and a small hatchet beside the bed. Around 10, I turned off the lantern and lay down, staring into the dark. Hours passed before I finally drifted toward sleep. Then I heard it again, the sound of something outside, only this time it wasn't on the porch. It was circling the cabin slowly, crunching on dry leaves and twigs. I could hear breathing, faint but deliberate. The steps stopped and started again, moving closer to the window near the kitchen. I stayed completely still. The air felt thick. I wanted to move but couldn't. After a minute or so, the sound faded toward the woods. I waited much longer before daring to get up. I pointed my flashlight at the window but didn't see anything except the reflection of my own pale face. I sat in the chair the rest of the night, too tense to sleep. When daylight finally came, I walked outside again, this time with the hatchet in hand. The prints were there again, boots. Deep impressions circling the cabin this time. Whoever it was had been out there for a while. I packed my things. I didn't even eat breakfast. The idea of staying another night felt impossible. But when I went to start my truck, it didn't turn over. The engine clicked once and went dead. I tried again. Nothing. I lifted the hood, checked the cables, but everything looked fine. The battery was new. Then I saw it. The red cable had been unscrewed and left hanging loose. That's when the fear turned into something colder. Someone had been close enough to my truck to tamper with it while I was inside. I reattached the cable and started it immediately. It roared to life. I didn't bother going back inside for anything I might have forgotten. I just drove out, tires throwing gravel behind me. About 5 miles down the dirt road, I saw a white pickup parked off to the side near a logging trail. The driver's side door was open, and nobody was in sight. As I passed, I noticed muddy boots on the ground near it, caked with the same kind of soil around the cabin. I didn't stop. I kept driving until I reached the main highway. Only then did I pull over and sit there for a while, trying to steady my breathing. When I got back home that evening, I called the owner of the cabin. I told him someone had been on the property during my stay, maybe trying to break in. He sounded surprised but said there were no neighbors nearby and no reports of trespassing before. He offered me a refund, but I didn't care about the money. For a few days afterward, I kept thinking about those prints, the door left open, the unscrewed cable. Whoever it was had been watching, maybe waiting. The cabin was too isolated, too quiet. It wasn't a ghost or anything supernatural. It was just a person. A real person who knew I was alone and out of reach. Sometimes, late at night, I still think about the sound of those slow footsteps circling the walls. I can still picture the marks in the dirt, the cold morning light, and that white truck sitting empty on the side of the road. I've been camping since then, but never alone, and never anywhere that far out again. The scariest thing I learned that weekend wasn't about what might be hiding in the dark. It was about who might be. It was late October of 2014 when I decided to take a short trip into the northern woods of Montana. I'd been driving for hours, the air getting colder the deeper I went into the back roads. My plan was simple: get away for a few days, do some hiking, maybe fish a bit before the weather got too rough. I wasn't trying to do anything special, just needed some quiet. I had rented an old cabin I found listed online, a place someone described as rustic and private. When I finally got there, it looked more like abandoned than anything else. The cabin sat at the end of a narrow dirt road that looked like no one had driven on it in years. The trees leaned inward like they were trying to close the road off completely. The place itself was small, a single-story wooden cabin, weather-beaten and sagging in places. The wood was gray from years of rain and wind, the roof patchy and caved slightly near one corner. The windows were clouded and one of the shutters hung by a single hinge. There was a faint smell of rot in the air, the kind that clings to damp wood and soil. Still, I told myself it was fine. I'd be there for 3 days at most. I'd make do. When I stepped inside, the first thing that hit me was the smell: old dust, mold, and the faint scent of animals that had probably nested there. The floor creaked with every step. There was a single table in the center, a small bed in the corner with a thin mattress, and a rusted stove that looked like it hadn't been used in decades. A few old newspapers were scattered across the table, their pages yellow and brittle. I brushed one open and saw a date from 1988. It made me wonder when the last person had actually stayed here. The first night wasn't terrible, but it wasn't exactly peaceful either. I lit a small fire in the stove using some wood I found stacked outside. It smoked more than it burned, filling the room with a sour smell that made my eyes water. The wind outside kept pressing against the walls, making them groan softly. Every now and then I'd hear something move out in the trees, probably deer or raccoons, but in a place that remote, every sound carried too much weight. I laid on the bed, fully clothed, and tried to ignore it all. I must have dozed off at some point, because when I woke up the fire was out and the air inside was freezing. I could hear the faint sound of dripping water somewhere. Slow, steady, almost rhythmic. I sat up, rubbing my hands together for warmth, and realized it wasn't raining outside. The dripping was coming from somewhere inside. I followed the sound to the far corner near the stove, where the ceiling boards had gone soft. A dark stain spread across the wood above, and water dripped from it onto the floor, forming a small puddle. I sighed, grabbed a metal pot, and placed it under the leak. When the first drop hit, it made a hollow ping that echoed through the cabin. Sounded louder than it should have. The next morning, I walked out behind the cabin to see where the leak might have come from. The roof up there looked worse than I thought. The wood was soft and green with moss, and the shingles were mostly gone. Near the back, there was a large hole where rainwater had clearly gotten in for years. I figured that explained the damp smell inside. But something else caught my eye, a large metal barrel half buried in the ground near the tree line. The lid was rusted shut, and the sides were dented like someone had hit it with something heavy. Around it, the dirt looked disturbed, uneven in patches, as if someone had been digging there at some point. I didn't think much of it then, maybe trash or fuel storage from whoever owned the cabin before. That day I tried to do some hiking, but the woods around that area felt wrong. Not in any dramatic way, but just quiet, too quiet. I didn't see a single bird or animal the entire time. No tracks, no sounds, just the occasional creak of trees moving in the wind. Even the air felt heavy. I only stayed out for about an hour before heading back. When I got back, the air inside the cabin felt damp again, like it was pulling moisture out of the walls. I opened a small window to let some air in, but it didn't help much. As evening came, I lit another small fire, cooked a bit of canned food, and sat by the table writing in a notebook. That's when I heard it again, the dripping. Only this time it wasn't steady. Came in short bursts, fast at first, then stopping, then starting again. It didn't sound like water anymore either. It had a thicker sound, almost like something heavier hitting the wood. I looked up at the ceiling, but the leak had stopped. The sound was coming from underneath. The floorboards under the table had a small gap near the edge where I could see darkness below. I knelt down, pulled the table aside, and pressed my ear close. The sound was faint now, but definitely there, a soft, wet tapping. I pushed against one of the boards and it shifted slightly. The nails were rusted and came loose easily. I pried one up enough to see a small crawl space beneath the cabin, maybe 2 feet deep. It was too dark to see much, but the dirt looked disturbed, like someone had dug there before. I dropped the board back in place and sat there for a while, just staring at it. I told myself it was probably an animal trapped under there. Maybe a raccoon or something trying to dig its way out. But something about it felt off. The pattern of the sounds, it wasn't random like scratching or digging. It was slower, almost cautious. That night, I barely slept. Every few minutes, I'd hear something from underneath. Small, slow movements, like someone shifting in the dirt. The sound would stop if I moved or stood up. It went on like that for hours. By morning, I decided I was done. Whatever that was, I didn't want to stick around to find out. When I stepped outside, though, I noticed something new. The ground near the metal barrel had been disturbed again. The dirt there was looser, freshly moved. There were faint marks leading from the barrel toward the cabin. Not footprints exactly, but trails, like something had been dragged. I froze, staring at it for a long time, trying to make sense of it. It didn't look like an animal's doing. I walked closer, crouched down, and saw the lid of the barrel had been slightly shifted open. It wasn't much, just an inch or so, but enough for me to see the black interior. The smell coming out of it was strong, earthy and metallic, like rust mixed with decay. I didn't touch it. I backed away, got inside, and started packing. As I loaded my bag, I heard it again. A single heavy thump from underneath the cabin. Not like the light tapping before. This was solid, forceful. The floor actually vibrated. I froze, staring down at the spot near the table. Another thump came, louder, then nothing. The silence afterward was worse than the sound itself. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, circling to the back. I crouched near the base of the cabin and shone the light into the crawlspace opening. The beam caught something. A small section of the dirt looked darker, freshly disturbed, like something had been uncovered. But what made me stop breathing was the sight of a piece of fabric barely visible through the soil. The edge of a sleeve, maybe dark brown and stiff with dirt. I didn't move closer. I didn't want to confirm what I already suspected. I backed up slowly, flashlight still in hand, and looked toward the barrel again. The smell in the air was stronger now, drifting in waves. I turned and walked straight to my truck, heart pounding, and started the engine. The road back felt longer than before, the woods pressing in tighter. I didn't look back. Later, when I was back in town, I went straight to the sheriff's office and told them about what I'd found. The cabin, the barrel, the crawl space, everything. They went out there the next day. When they came back, one of the deputies told me they'd found several old remains buried under the cabin and near that barrel. No one knew who they were or how long they'd been there, but judging by the condition, it had been decades. The cabin was marked off as a crime scene, and a week later, it was demolished. I never went back to that part of Montana again. I don't even like driving through wooded areas anymore. I still think about that sound sometimes, the slow tapping from beneath the floor. I try not to imagine what it really was, but some nights, when everything's quiet, I can still hear it in my head, that steady, cautious rhythm of something moving in the dark, waiting just beneath my feet. It was the winter of 2013 when I rented that old cabin on the edge of Dartmoor, in the southwest of England. I was 31 then, working as a freelance photographer, and I had driven out there to spend a few quiet weeks alone, away from the city and the noise that seemed to follow me everywhere. The cabin belonged to a man who ran a small post office in a nearby village called Lidford. He said it used to be a ranger's place, built decades ago before the area became a nature reserve. It looked decent in the pictures he sent. Plain, wooden, and tucked between a row of tall fir trees. I thought it would be perfect for editing my photos and clearing my head. The first few days were quiet. The air was sharp and clean, and the only sounds were wind, crows, and the occasional car that passed the gravel road at a distance. The cabin had no Wi-Fi, only a weak signal that came and went near the front steps. Inside, it smelled like old pine and damp wool. The floor creaked when I walked, and every night I could hear the faint tapping of branches against the roof. I got used to the silence, though. I spent my mornings hiking through the moor, taking pictures of the empty fields and the mist that always seemed to hang low, even when it wasn't raining. It was on the 6th night that I first noticed something strange. Around 11, I was editing some photos when I heard crunching sounds outside, soft, slow footsteps on the gravel. The sound stopped and started again, like someone pacing. I turned off my small desk lamp and peered through the window. It was too dark to see clearly, but the motion sensor light near the shed flicked on. For a second, I saw the outline of someone near the tree line, a thin figure standing still. I assumed it was a hiker or maybe a local cutting through the woods. But when I stepped out onto the porch to check, there was no one there, just the wind and the faint smell of damp soil. I told myself it was probably an animal, maybe a deer or fox. I locked the door and went to bed. But that night, I didn't sleep much. Every time I started drifting off, I thought I heard movement again. Faint scraping against the wall, like nails brushing the wood. When I got up in the morning, I went outside and saw faint shoe prints in the mud near the back of the cabin. They were small, like a woman's, and they led away toward the trees. I didn't think much of it then, but it left a strange feeling in my stomach all day. A few days passed quietly again. I told myself I had imagined most of it. I was alone for too long, that's all. But one evening, I was sitting near the fireplace, writing in my notebook, when I noticed something off outside the window again. The motion light flicked on, and this time I saw her clearly for a brief second. A woman standing near the shed, just far enough that I couldn't make out her face. She wore a pale coat that looked too thin for the cold, and her hair was dark, hanging loose over her shoulders. She wasn't moving. She was just standing there, facing the cabin. I stayed still, not sure what to do. After maybe 20 seconds, the light went off again, and she disappeared into the dark. I couldn't bring myself to go outside. I checked the locks twice, pulled the curtains shut, and stayed by the fire until morning. When the sun came up, I walked to where she'd been standing. The grass and mud were disturbed. I found the marks of her shoes again. Same size, same narrow pattern. I followed them a few feet until they vanished into the thick brush. There were no houses nearby, no paths that way, just woods and uneven ground. That day I drove to the nearest store, which was about 15 minutes away, and bought a lock for the shed, a flashlight, and a small knife I didn't really need but bought anyway. The man behind the counter said something about the weather turning bad, maybe a storm coming in the next few days. I didn't mention anything about the woman. I just wanted to get back before dark. That night was worse. Around midnight, the sound came back. Footsteps, but heavier this time. I sat on my bed, holding the flashlight, trying to listen. The footsteps circled the cabin once, then stopped by the back door. I didn't move for a long time. The silence stretched until I thought maybe she had gone. But then I heard a faint scratching sound again. Not at the wall this time, but the window. I didn't look. I just stayed still until I couldn't hear anything anymore. In the morning, I found what she had been doing. On the window, there were marks. Long, uneven lines made by something sharp, maybe a stone or a nail. They weren't random. They looked deliberate, like she had been tracing something. The same pattern repeated on the shed door too, small half circles overlapping each other. I felt sick when I saw them. That afternoon, I packed my things. I had planned to stay another week, but I couldn't shake the thought that someone was watching me every night. When I went to start the car, though, the engine didn't turn over. I tried again and again, but it only made a clicking sound. I lifted the hood and saw that one of the wires had been cut. Clean, straight cut, not chewed or corroded. I didn't have tools or signal to call anyone. The nearest village was too far to walk with night coming. I stayed inside again, this time with a knife by my side. The air felt colder that night. Around 1 in the morning, the motion light flicked on again. I looked through a small gap in the curtain. She was there again, closer than before, standing at the edge of the porch steps. I could see her better now. Her coat was dirty, the hem dark with mud, and her face looked pale, hollow somehow, like someone who hadn't slept in days. She wasn't looking directly at the door, but slightly to the side, as if listening. I held my breath, waiting for her to move. She didn't. She stood there for what felt like an hour before the light timed out and everything went black again. I didn't move all night. I waited until dawn, when the first light came through the window, and then I packed everything I could fit into my backpack. I started walking down the gravel road toward the main road. The forest around me was quiet. No birds, no wind, nothing. After half an hour, I saw a car coming from the village. I waved it down. It was a farmer heading toward Tavistock. He gave me a lift into town. I didn't go back to that cabin again. I left the key in the mailbox of the post office and told the owner I had to leave early for personal reasons. He just nodded and didn't ask questions. Later, when I got back to London, I had the car towed from Dartmoor and repaired. The mechanic confirmed it, the wire had been cut with a blade. Weeks later, I looked through the photos I had taken during that trip. In one of the pictures, a shot of the cabin taken from the edge of the woods, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. Between the trees, barely visible, there was a shape, a figure, a woman, standing still, facing the camera. I zoomed in, and even though her face was blurred by the focus, I recognized the same pale coat, the same dark hair. I deleted the picture immediately, but it stayed in my head long after. Sometimes I still wonder who she was. Maybe someone who lived there once, maybe someone who got lost and never left the woods, or maybe she was just a stranger passing through. But what stays with me most is how quiet it was every night before she appeared, how the air felt heavy, like it was waiting for something. Every sound, every shadow felt like it meant something. Even now, when I think about that place, I remember the cold air, the soft crunch of footsteps, and that faint outline of a woman who never said a word, never came closer, but somehow made the whole world around that cabin feel smaller, darker, and more dangerous than anything I've ever known. It was the fall of 2016 when I took the seasonal job as a park ranger at Blackridge National Forest in northern Montana. I was 32 then, with more quiet than company in my life. I'd worked short contracts before, fire lookout, trail maintenance, campground attendant, but this one came at the perfect time. The job offered isolation, a small cabin deep inside the forest, and miles of quiet trails that only a handful of hikers ever touched. I wanted that kind of silence. The cabin was about 12 miles from the nearest paved road, tucked near a lake that had no name on the official maps. It was built in the 70s, back when the Park Service had money to put up solid wooden stations in remote areas. The logs were gray from years of sun and rain, the roof covered with moss, and the porch tilted slightly forward. Inside, it smelled of old wood and damp clothes. The air was always cool, even during the day. The cabin had a small kitchen with a gas stove, a metal sink connected to a rainwater tank, one bedroom with a single bed, and a narrow desk pushed under the window facing the trees. There was no electricity. I used a propane lantern at night and kept my phone switched off most of the time since service didn't reach that deep anyway. My duties were simple. Every morning I checked the trail markers, made sure no trees had fallen across the paths, and recorded any animal tracks I found. Once a week, I drove down to the ranger station 30 miles away to report in and pick up supplies. It was routine work until one night in early October when things started to feel wrong. That day had been cold and gray. The sky had stayed the color of old steel since morning, and a thin drizzle soaked the woods. I spent most of the day repairing a section of fencing near the southern trailhead, about 2 miles from my cabin. The ground was muddy, and by the time I finished, my boots were heavy with wet soil. I started back just before dusk, following the narrow trail that wound through the pines. The forest was quiet except for the soft patter of rain on the leaves. I didn't see a single animal, not even birds. The air had that strange stillness that comes right before the temperature drops fast. When I reached the cabin, darkness had already settled. I took off my wet jacket and hung it near the door. I heated a can of soup on the stove and ate in silence, listening to the rain tapping the roof. I was used to being alone, used to the way the night could stretch so wide that you almost felt swallowed by it. But that night I felt uneasy. I couldn't explain why. Maybe it was the way the wind moved through the trees, a low whistling that sounded too steady, too deliberate. After eating, I filled the lantern, checked the locks on the windows, and sat by the small desk to write my daily report. My handwriting looked shaky under the yellow light. When I finished, I noticed something strange. The sound of the rain had stopped, but there was still that faint noise, like footsteps crunching on wet leaves, coming from behind the cabin. Slow, careful steps, stopping for a few seconds, then starting again. I froze. I told myself it was an animal, probably a deer or maybe a bear nosing around. I reached for the flashlight hanging near the door and stepped out onto the porch. The air was cold enough to make my breath visible. My light cut through the darkness, showing only the slick shapes of trees and the glint of wet grass. Nothing moved, but the feeling that someone or something was nearby didn't go away. I circled the cabin, my boots sinking into the mud. Behind the cabin was the rainwater tank, half full, and beyond it the tree line. The ground was disturbed. I could see prints in the mud, but the rain had smeared them. They didn't look like animal tracks. Too long, too narrow. Like boots. Human boots. It was unsettling, but I told myself maybe a hiker got lost and wandered close. That happens sometimes. Still, there were no signs of anyone calling out or using a flashlight. I stayed outside for a few minutes, scanning the trees, but the forest was dead quiet. Finally, I went back in, bolted the door, and tried to sleep. That night, I barely did. Every sound outside felt sharp and close. Around midnight, I heard it again. Those same slow steps moving past the cabin, circling it. I stayed still, staring at the ceiling. The sound stopped near the porch. I held my breath, waiting for something to happen. Nothing did. After a long while, I must have drifted off. The next morning, the ground outside was covered with thin frost. I went around the cabin to check again, and the prints were still there, clearer now in the frozen mud. They were definitely from boots. The heel pattern was deep, and I could see where the person had stopped and turned toward the cabin wall. The prints led toward the trees and vanished. I followed them for about 100 yards before they disappeared into the thicker forest. I stood there for a while, scanning between the pines. The air was crisp, and the forest looked ordinary, too ordinary. I didn't like the idea of someone wandering around that close at night, not this far into the woods. I made a note to report it next time I drove out to the station. That day, I tried to keep busy. I checked the north trail and cleared a fallen branch, but the feeling of being watched stayed with me. The forest felt heavier somehow, like it was holding its breath. Around dusk, clouds gathered again, and the light faded early. I went inside, locked up, and sat by the window for a long time, staring into the dark. Around 10, I heard it again. Not footsteps this time, but a faint metallic sound, like something brushing against the door latch. I grabbed the flashlight and pointed it at the window. Nothing. My heart was pounding hard enough to make my hands shake. I waited, listening. Then came a soft scrape, like fingers sliding over the wood. I didn't open the door. I stayed where I was, not moving, not breathing until the sound stopped. After that, silence. I didn't sleep that night either. When morning came, I found something new. On the porch railing, there were scratches, 3 of them long and straight, cut deep into the wood. Not claw marks, more like someone dragged a knife there. I checked the door too. The metal latch had a small dent. Someone had tried to lift it open. That was enough for me. I packed a few things, took the truck, and drove down to the ranger station. The drive felt endless. Every turn, every shadow between the trees looked like someone could be standing there. At the station, I told the supervisor what I'd found. The tracks, the scratches, the sounds. He said it might have been a hunter who got lost or some trespasser looking for a place to stay. There'd been reports of illegal trapping in that part of the forest. He sent another ranger back with me that afternoon to check the area. When we got to the cabin, everything was quiet again. The tracks were half frozen now, the scratches still there. The other ranger, an older guy named Collins, went through the woods with me for a while. We didn't find anyone, but about half a mile east, we came across a small clearing with the remains of a campfire, still damp but recent. Near it were the bones of a deer picked clean. Someone had been staying out there, close enough to watch the cabin. We reported it and marked the site, but no one was ever caught. I stayed another week before the assignment ended, but I never slept properly again in that cabin. Every night, I kept the lantern on and sat with my back to the wall, waiting for footsteps that never came again. When I finally left, I looked back at that cabin from the trail, the dark shape of it against the trees, the porch leaning, the door latch still dented. It looked peaceful in the daylight, almost ordinary, but I knew what it felt like at night, when the forest went silent and the cold pressed against the windows. Sometimes I still think about those tracks and the sound of someone moving around in the dark. How close they must have been, how long they might have been watching before I ever noticed. It's the kind of thing that stays with you. Out there, in the woods, you realize how thin the line is between being alone and being watched. And that's what scared me most. Not what I saw, but what I didn't. It was late September of 2004 when I decided to spend a week alone at my uncle's old farm cabin in southern Nebraska. I was 28 at the time, tired of the city, and just wanted some quiet away from everything. My uncle had passed years ago, and no one in the family really went there anymore. The place had been left to fall apart slowly, standing in the middle of a wide stretch of farmland that hadn't been worked since the late 90s. The fields were mostly overgrown with dry weeds and dead corn stalks, and the old fence posts leaned like broken ribs around the property. I drove out there on a cold Thursday morning. The road was empty most of the way, just a long ribbon of cracked asphalt cutting through flat, pale land. The sky had that gray, washed-out look it gets before the first frost. When I reached the dirt turnoff that led to the cabin, my truck bounced over ruts deep enough to swallow the tires. I remember the smell of dry soil and burnt hay carried by the wind, the kind of smell that feels lonely. The cabin sat a few hundred feet back from the road, surrounded by open field and an old barn that leaned to one side. The paint had long since peeled off both buildings, and the tin roof of the barn was half collapsed. The windows on the cabin were clouded with dust. The air around the place was still. No birds, no movement, just the sound of the wind dragging across the dry grass. Inside, everything smelled like old wood and mold. The floor creaked under my boots. There was a single room with a narrow hallway leading to a small kitchen and bedroom. Dust covered everything, even the old iron stove in the corner. I opened a few windows to let in some air, though it didn't help much. The smell of rot clung to everything. I spent the first few hours cleaning and unpacking. I brought canned food, a sleeping bag, and a few tools in case something needed fixing. The electricity still worked somehow, though the light bulbs were dim and flickered every so often. The water ran too, but it came out brown at first before clearing. It felt like the place was still trying to wake up after years of being left alone. By sunset, the fields turned a dull gold. The wind picked up, and I heard something metallic tapping from the direction of the barn. I went out to check and saw one of the loose sheets of tin slapping against the frame. I nailed it down and looked around before heading back. From out there, the cabin looked small, almost lost in the tall weeds. For a second, I thought about how easy it would be for someone or something to be standing out in that grass, completely hidden. That thought made me uneasy, and I walked back faster than I meant to. That first night, I barely slept. The wind hit the cabin hard, and I could hear dry branches scraping against the roof. Around midnight, I heard what sounded like footsteps outside, slow, heavy steps moving through the weeds near the back of the house. I froze. The sound stopped after a few seconds. I told myself it was probably a deer or some animal, but it didn't sound like that. It had a rhythm to it like a person walking. The next morning, I went out behind the cabin. The weeds were crushed in a path that led toward the old barn. They looked fresh, like someone had walked through during the night. My stomach felt tight as I followed the trail, but when I got to the barn, there was nothing there. Inside, the place was a wreck, broken tools, rusted chains, and piles of rotted hay. The smell was strong, a mix of damp and something sour. I noticed what looked like an old sleeping bag buried under some junk near the back. It was torn open, and something about it looked off. It had stains, dark and stiff, and I didn't want to think too hard about what they were. That day, I tried to stay busy. I worked on clearing out the kitchen and fixing the loose door hinges. I even went out to the nearby creek just to get away from the cabin for a while. But the feeling of being watched didn't leave me. Every time I turned, I half expected to see someone standing behind me in the field. There was nothing, always nothing, but that didn't make it better. By the third day, things got worse. I woke up to find the back door open. I knew I had locked it before going to bed. I even checked twice the night before because of how uneasy I'd felt. But now it was wide open, swinging slightly in the cold morning air. There were footprints in the dirt, leading away from the door toward the barn again. I followed them slowly, each step heavier than the last. The prints were deep, clear, like boots, not animal tracks. Inside the barn, something had changed. The old sleeping bag was gone. I stood there for a long time, just listening. The air was completely still, but I could hear my heart pounding in my ears. When I finally turned to leave, I noticed something new carved into one of the wooden posts near the door. 3 deep lines scratched into the surface, uneven but deliberate. It looked fresh. That night, I barricaded the door with a chair and sat up with my flashlight. Every noise made me jump. The floorboards creaked every few minutes, but I couldn't tell if it was the wind or someone moving. Around 2 a.m., the power flickered out. The room went completely dark except for the beam of my flashlight. I sat there for what felt like hours, staring at the door, waiting for something to happen. When morning came, the chair I had pushed against the door was moved aside. The door was shut, but unlocked. I didn't sleep again after that. I packed up most of my things that afternoon, planning to leave the next morning. But before I did, I wanted to take one last look around. I went back to the barn, almost out of stubbornness, to see if I could make sense of any of it. Inside, there was a faint smell of smoke. Near the far wall, I found a small pile of ashes, still warm. Someone had burned something there recently. Mixed in the ashes were bits of metal and what looked like the remains of fabric. Blue denim maybe, hard to tell. I poked at it with a stick and something small rolled out from the ash. It was a button, scorched black, with a piece of thread still clinging to it. At that point, I didn't care to know more. I went straight back to the cabin and sat on the porch until dark, too shaken to even go inside. The whole place felt wrong, like it was holding its breath, waiting. When the sun went down, I stayed in my truck, doors locked, engine running. I didn't sleep. Around midnight, I saw movement near the barn. A figure, barely visible in the moonlight, crouched near the doorway. I couldn't make out details, just the outline of someone tall, moving slowly. They disappeared into the dark after a few seconds. I left before dawn. I didn't even bother going back inside the cabin for the rest of my things. I drove until the road hit the highway and didn't stop until I was 2 towns over. When I got home, I tried to convince myself it was just a squatter or maybe some local living out there. But the more I thought about it, the less sense it made. Whoever it was had been careful, deliberate. They didn't take anything, didn't damage anything. They just moved things around, watched, waited. A few weeks later, I looked up the property records. The county listed the land as abandoned. No one had reported living there in over a decade. The barn, they noted, had once been used to store old equipment. But there was also a mention of a man found dead there back in 1992. A drifter, they said. Cause of death was never determined. I never went back. I still think about that night sometimes. How the door kept opening, how those footprints circled the cabin, and how someone had been living out there long before I arrived, hiding in plain sight, waiting for anyone foolish enough to come alone. I keep the cabin key in a drawer at home. Every once in a while, I catch myself holding it, feeling the rough metal edges, and wondering if whoever stayed out there before me ever really left. But then I remind myself, whoever it was, they had every chance to do worse. Maybe they just wanted the place left alone. And that's exactly what I've done ever since. It was late autumn of 2011 when I went back to my grandfather's old cabin deep in the woods of northern Montana. He had passed away almost 8 years earlier, and ever since then, the cabin had been sitting empty. My family never went back there after his funeral. My mother couldn't stand the place. She said it carried too many memories. But for me, I always felt a pull toward it. Something about the quietness of that land, the smell of pine, and the sound of wind through the trees that made me feel grounded. I didn't go there for nostalgia, though. I went because I needed space. My job had been falling apart. My relationship ended in the worst possible way, and I was drinking more than I should. The cabin felt like the only place I could disappear to for a while. The drive took most of the day. The last 20 miles were rough, old dirt roads full of deep tire grooves from years of logging trucks. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was already low behind the trees. The cabin stood just like I remembered it. Old, narrow, made from thick dark logs with a small tin chimney and a porch that leaned slightly to one side. The forest around it had grown denser, and tall weeds had swallowed the path that once led down to the lake. Everything looked frozen in time but tired, as if it had been holding its breath for years. Inside, the air was heavy with that damp, wooden smell that comes from being shut up too long. The windows were covered in grime, and dust clung to every surface. I dropped my duffel bag near the door and walked through each room slowly. The kitchen still had the same rusted sink, the same crooked shelf my grandfather had built himself. The main room was cluttered with old hunting gear, empty cans, and a few tools scattered on a workbench. The small bedroom in the back still had his old metal-framed bed, the same wool blanket folded at the end. As the light faded, I started a small fire in the stove. The crackling sound filled the silence, and for a moment it felt peaceful. I made some instant noodles, ate them straight out of the pot, and sat there just listening to the wind. It was cold, but not unbearable. The place had a strange stillness to it. Every creak in the floor, every shift in the walls seemed louder than it should have been. The next morning, I went out to check the shed behind the cabin. My grandfather used to store tools there, and I thought I might find some things I could use to clean up the place. The shed was about 20 yards from the cabin, half buried in overgrown grass. Its door was jammed shut from swelling and rot, so I had to use my shoulder to push it open. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of old oil, rust, and earth. I found some things still hanging on the walls, an old axe, a saw, some fishing gear. Everything was covered in dust. I started pulling out some boxes and tossing junk into a pile outside. When I moved one of the larger crates near the back wall, I noticed something odd. There was a spot on the floor where the dirt looked disturbed. It wasn't fresh, but it was different from the rest, darker, uneven. I crouched down, brushed some of the dust away, and saw a corner of old plastic poking through the dirt. At first, I thought it might be some trash or maybe a buried tarp. But the plastic looked thick, industrial, like the kind used for wrapping large objects. Curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed a shovel that was leaning by the door and started digging. The dirt was packed tight, and the deeper I went, the heavier that smell got. It was a sour, rotting scent that made my stomach twist. About 2 feet down, I hit something solid. When I pulled more dirt away, I saw a shape, wrapped tightly in black plastic, sealed with duct tape. My first thought was maybe my grandfather had buried an animal or something. But when I scraped more dirt away, I saw the outline of what looked like a shoulder. My hands started shaking. I kept uncovering more until I was staring at what was unmistakably a human body. I stepped back, heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. The shed suddenly felt smaller, the air too thick to breathe. I dropped the shovel and backed out into the sunlight. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of it. It didn't make any sense. My grandfather was a quiet man, strict but not cruel. He was the kind of man who would fix broken chairs, feed stray dogs, and sit on the porch for hours watching the trees. I couldn't believe that same man could have buried a body behind his cabin. After a few minutes, I forced myself to go back inside. I didn't want to touch it again, but I needed to see more to be sure. I peeled a small section of the plastic back, just enough to see what was underneath. The smell hit me so hard I gagged. The body was mostly bones, but there were still bits of leathery skin clinging to them. The clothes were faded, torn, and discolored. From what was left, I could tell it was a man, maybe middle-aged. His boots were still on, and there was a rusted watch still around the wrist. I stumbled out again, sat down on the ground, and tried to steady myself. I stayed there for a long time, staring at the trees, feeling sick. I didn't know what to do. There was no cell service that far into the woods. The nearest town was over 30 miles away. I thought about just leaving right then, but something about that idea felt wrong. This was my grandfather's place. That body had been there for years, maybe decades, and nobody ever knew. As the day went on, I started looking through the cabin for anything that might explain it. In an old drawer under the workbench, I found a small notebook. The pages were damp, most of the ink smeared, but some writing was still readable. Most of it was just hunting notes, lists of things he needed to fix, dates of fishing trips. But near the back, there was an entry from 1984 that caught my eye. It said something about the man from the road and the fight by the shed. The words were hard to read, but it was enough to make my skin crawl. I spent the rest of the day pacing around, thinking about what to do. The sun went down early, and by the time darkness fell, the cabin felt different, heavier, as if something was pressing down on it. I barely slept that night. Every sound outside made me tense up. I kept seeing that body in my head, that black plastic buried under the dirt. The next morning, I packed my things and left. I didn't even look back at the cabin. It took almost 2 hours before I finally got cell service. I pulled over near an old gas station and called the county sheriff's office. I told them what I found, gave them directions, and waited there until they arrived. They went back out to the cabin that same day. A week later, one of the deputies called me. They confirmed the remains were of a man who had gone missing in 1984, a drifter who had been last seen near the old highway north of town. They never had any suspects. The deputy didn't say much else, but his tone was heavy, like he knew more than he wanted to share. They said the case was being reopened, and that was that. I never went back to the cabin after that. I sold the land a few months later. Sometimes I still think about that body, about how long it must have been there while my grandfather lived out his days quietly, fixing things and sitting on that porch like nothing had ever happened. I think about what might have happened that night in 1984, what could have made him do something like that. The strangest part is, when they dug up the rest of the ground near the shed, they didn't find anything else. No weapon, no signs of struggle, nothing that could explain it. Just that one body, wrapped neatly, buried deep, as if my grandfather had wanted it to stay hidden forever. Every time I think about it now, I realize that some parts of people, even those you think you know best, can stay buried for a lifetime, quiet, still, and waiting for someone like me to dig them up by mistake. It was late October of 2016 when my boss, Raymond, asked me to join him for a weekend trip to his cabin up north. He said it would be a quiet place where we could finish the upcoming project without the noise of the city. I was 29 at the time, working as an assistant in his construction firm, and I didn't think twice about going. He was strict but fair, and being invited to his private cabin felt like a sign of trust. I agreed, thinking it would be 2 days of paperwork, silence, and maybe a bit of peace away from everything. The drive took nearly 5 hours. We left before dawn from Chicago and headed toward the northern edge of Wisconsin. The roads became emptier with every passing mile, and the trees grew thicker and taller until they looked like dark walls closing in on both sides of the road. By the time we reached the dirt path that led to the cabin, the sky had turned a heavy gray. The air smelled like wet leaves and cold wood smoke drifting from somewhere far off. The cabin sat at the edge of a small clearing surrounded by pine and birch trees. It looked older than I expected. The paint was peeling from the siding, and the porch steps sagged slightly. The windows were fogged from the inside, and the roof had a dull brown stain spreading across it. Still, it looked solid, isolated, and quiet. Exactly what he had promised. The lake behind the cabin stretched wide and still, with patches of mist floating low over the water. Inside, it smelled faintly of burnt coffee and old wood. The main room had a stone fireplace, a small kitchen area, and a table covered with blueprints and papers. There were 2 bedrooms, one on each side of the cabin. Raymond took the bigger one, leaving me the smaller one near the back. The floor creaked in places, but the whole place had a strange warmth to it. Not comfortable exactly, but heavy and quiet, like the walls had seen too many winters. The first day went fine. We worked until late afternoon, sketching out designs and checking old reports. I remember noticing how quiet it was. No cars, no birds, not even the sound of the wind through the trees. Every small noise, the scratching of a pencil, the creak of a chair, the pop from the fireplace, sounded too sharp, too loud. It was like the silence around us swallowed everything else. That night, I couldn't sleep well. The mattress in my room was thin, and every time I moved, the springs groaned. I heard faint sounds coming from the other side of the cabin. Footsteps maybe, or the sound of someone shifting furniture. I assumed it was Raymond moving around before bed. But after a while, I realized the noises didn't sound steady. They stopped and started like someone walking slowly, pausing, then walking again. Once, I thought I heard something outside, a crunch in the dirt near the window. When I looked, I saw only darkness, just my own reflection in the glass. The next morning, I mentioned nothing. I didn't want to seem nervous or paranoid. We went back to work, but Raymond seemed off. His shirt was wrinkled, and his eyes looked heavy, like he hadn't slept either. He spent most of the morning outside, pacing near the lake and checking his phone even though there was no signal out there. When he came back in, he looked pale and distracted. He told me he'd been hearing things too, though he didn't say it that way exactly. He said he thought there were animals around, maybe a fox or a bear. He had seen tracks near the edge of the woods. That day dragged on. By late afternoon, clouds rolled in, and it started to rain. The sound of the rain on the roof was steady at first, but then it grew heavier, drumming against the wood like fingers tapping in rhythm. The air inside grew colder, and we lit the fireplace again. The light flickered across the room, and every shadow looked like it was breathing. After dinner, I went to wash up in the small sink near the kitchen. The window above it faced the woods. When I looked up, I caught a glimpse of something between the trees. A quick, dark shape, moving slowly and low to the ground. Could have been an animal, maybe a deer, but there was something strange about how it moved, too steady and too upright. When I looked again, it was gone. That night, I tried to sleep but couldn't. I lay there, listening to the sounds outside. Rain dripping from the roof, branches brushing the side of the cabin. Then, around midnight, I heard it again, that same crunch of footsteps in the dirt, moving slowly around the cabin. I held my breath, trying to tell myself it was an animal, maybe the same one I saw earlier. But the steps stopped right outside my window. I could feel the faint vibration of the ground through the wooden floor. Then there was a sound like breathing, slow, uneven, right outside the glass. I stayed still until it stopped. In the morning, I went outside first thing. The rain had stopped, but the ground was soft with mud. There were prints near my window, long, deep marks, not from boots, not from paws. They were just irregular shapes, pressed into the ground as if someone had been kneeling there. I showed them to Raymond, and he looked at them for a long time without saying anything. He just went inside, packed a few things, and said we might leave earlier than planned. But the car wouldn't start. The battery was dead, even though it had been fine the day before. We spent half the day trying to fix it, but we had no tools other than a wrench and some wire. The rain returned by evening, and we had no choice but to stay another night. That final night was the worst. The power went out around 9. We lit candles and sat in the dim glow of the fire. Raymond barely spoke. His hands shook slightly when he wrote on his notepad. I kept thinking about the thing outside, wondering if it had ever left. Around midnight, the wind picked up, howling through the cracks in the walls. I tried to keep busy, checking the locks and shutting the windows tight. Sometime after 2, I heard a thud from outside, heavy, sharp, like someone dropped a log onto the ground. Then another. The dog barking sound echoed faintly from far off, though I never saw a dog around. Raymond stood near the window, frozen. I could see his reflection in the glass, pale and rigid. Then, without a word, he stepped back, grabbed the poker from the fireplace, and waited near the door. The next few minutes were a blur of sound. Something brushing the side of the cabin, the door rattling once, the scrape of wood against metal. I felt the walls tremble slightly, then silence again. Long, deep silence. When daylight came, everything was still. The rain had stopped, and the air was cold and damp. I went outside slowly, half expecting to see someone or something waiting, but there was nothing, just the smell of wet earth and pine. Only the marks remained, deep scuffs on the door, faint prints circling the cabin, and broken branches leading back into the trees. We left that morning as soon as we could get the engine started. Raymond didn't say much on the way back. He stared straight ahead, gripping the steering wheel hard enough to make his knuckles white. I didn't ask anything either. When we reached the city, he dropped me off without looking at me and never mentioned the trip again. A week later, I found out he had taken a leave of absence. No one said why. A few months after that, he sold the cabin. Sometimes, even now, I still think about that place. The silence, the rain, the prints outside the window. I tell myself it was just some animal, maybe a bear drawn by the smell of food. But deep down, I remember how deliberate those steps sounded, how they stopped right beneath my window, how they stayed still for so long, as if listening. I've never gone back to the woods since, and every time I hear the rain tapping on my windows at night, I still think of that cabin, sitting somewhere up north, empty and quiet, waiting through another storm. It was the fall of 1998 when I decided to drive up north to spend a weekend alone at a cabin I had rented in rural Montana. I was 34 at the time, working long hours as a construction foreman in Billings, and I needed to get away from everything for a few days. The cabin sat deep in the woods near a small lake, about 15 miles from the nearest gas station. It was one of those old wooden places that hadn't been updated in decades. Faded red paint on the outside, a tin roof that made every drop of rain sound like a hammer hit, and a small porch with 2 old chairs that creaked if you even looked at them too hard. The drive there was long and quiet. I left early in the morning, stopped for coffee and gas in a small town called Harlowton, and then followed the dirt road that twisted through thick pine woods. It was already late afternoon by the time I reached the cabin. The air smelled like cold sap and wet soil, and there wasn't a single sound except the wind and the crunch of my boots on the gravel. There was an old Ford pickup parked behind the cabin when I arrived. It looked like it hadn't been moved in years. Flat tires, rust on the hood, and a thick layer of dirt on the windshield. I figured it must have belonged to the owner or whoever used to live there before it became a rental. The cabin itself was small but solid. Inside, the walls were paneled with dark wood, and the air smelled faintly of old smoke and dampness. There was a fireplace built from rough stones, a small kitchen with a gas stove, and a single bed pushed against the far wall. The floorboards creaked under my boots. There was also a trapdoor near the back corner of the room square with a metal latch and a small handle. I noticed it right away but didn't think much of it at first. Probably just a crawl space or storage area, I told myself. I unpacked my stuff, lit a fire, and sat on the couch with a beer. The light outside faded fast, and soon the cabin was surrounded by darkness. I remember the sound of the wind picking up through the trees. It was the kind of wind that makes the whole forest move, like the woods themselves are breathing. Around 8, I heard something, a dull thud, like wood hitting wood, came from outside, somewhere near the porch. I figured it was just a branch falling, but the sound came again a few minutes later, closer this time. It wasn't loud, but it was distinct. When I stepped out onto the porch, the cold hit me instantly. My breath came out in white clouds. The forest was silent again. My flashlight beam moved through the trees and caught small flakes of dust in the air, but nothing else. No animals, no wind, nothing. I stood there for a minute listening, but the noise didn't return. Back inside, I shut the door and double-checked the locks. The sound didn't come again that night, but I barely slept. The next morning, I walked around the cabin just to ease my mind. I found fresh footprints near the porch steps, deep enough to show the tread of a boot. They weren't mine. I could tell because mine had a distinctive circular mark on the heel, while these didn't. They led around the side of the cabin and disappeared into the woods. That put me on edge. I looked around for a while but didn't see anyone. Maybe it was a hunter passing through, I thought. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I decided to stay busy, went fishing for a while, cooked a simple lunch, and tried not to think too much. But by late afternoon, I started feeling uneasy again. I noticed something odd near the old pickup truck behind the cabin. The driver's door was open. I was certain it had been closed the day before. I walked over, careful where I stepped, and looked inside. There wasn't much. Some empty bottles, a torn seat, and what looked like old sleeping gear in the back. But on the floor near the passenger seat was a rusty hunting knife. The handle was cracked, and the blade had dried stains on it, dark brown. I set it back down slowly. Something about that truck started to feel wrong, like whoever used it had just stepped away and never returned. That night, the sounds came back, but this time it wasn't a thud. It was softer, like shuffling, slow movement near the back of the cabin. I turned off the lantern and stood completely still, listening. The noise continued, a faint scraping sound against the wood, then silence again. My heartbeat felt too loud in the quiet room. I grabbed the flashlight and checked every corner of the cabin, even looked through the small back window. Couldn't see a thing. Then I remembered the trapdoor. I hadn't opened it since I arrived. I knelt beside it, ran my hand along the metal latch. It was cold, almost too cold, and stiff like it hadn't been moved in years. When I finally got it loose and lifted the door, a musty smell rose up from below. Earth, dust, and something else, like old meat gone bad. The beam from my flashlight revealed a short wooden ladder leading down into a small dirt crawl space. It It was about 4 feet high, low enough that I had to crouch to move. The space stretched under most of the cabin, the ground uneven and covered with old boards, bricks, and spider webs. In the far corner, I saw a large canvas tarp. The light caught a dark stain along the edge of it. My stomach turned. I moved closer, my hand shaking slightly, and pulled the tarp back. Underneath were 2 things: a torn sleeping bag and what looked like a set of old clothes, muddy jeans, a jacket, and heavy boots. But inside one of the boots was something that stopped me cold. A human toe bone. I froze, the beam of my flashlight trembling. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of it. Maybe it was from an animal, I thought at first, but no, it was too clean, too human. I looked again, and next to the clothes was something small and round. A plastic wallet, cracked with age. Inside, there was a faded driver's license. The photo was barely visible, but the name was clear: Frank Dillard. That name stuck in my head because the owner who rented the cabin to me, an older man I'd spoken to briefly over the phone, had introduced himself as Frank. I backed out of the crawl space fast, pulled the trapdoor shut, and pushed a chair over it. My heart wouldn't slow down. I didn't know if the man who rented the cabin to me was the same Frank from the license or if someone else had used his name. But whatever happened there, I didn't want to find out. I waited until dawn before leaving. I packed everything fast, barely checked if I'd forgotten anything. The forest felt heavier that morning, colder somehow. As I loaded my bag into the truck, I noticed something that made my skin crawl. The old pickup behind the cabin was gone. There were fresh tire tracks in the dirt, leading down the road I'd come from. I didn't waste another second. I drove off, the cabin shrinking in my rearview mirror until it disappeared between the trees. I didn't stop until I reached town, where I filled the tank and went straight to the sheriff's office. I told them everything about the noises, the footprints, the trapdoor, the clothes, the bone. A few weeks later, one of the deputies called me. They had gone up to check the cabin. According to them, there was nothing under the floor. No clothes, no tarp, no bone, nothing. The crawl space was empty. The only thing they found was an old wallet with the same name. But the ID inside was blank, no photo, no numbers. The man who rented me the cabin was never found. The phone number I had for him stopped working. The property was listed under a different name entirely. I never went back to Montana after that. But sometimes, late at night, I think about that truck disappearing into the woods before dawn. The sound of its tires crushing the gravel, and I wonder if someone had been there the whole time, waiting below my feet, just listening. And every time I picture that cold morning air, I can still smell the faint trace of that rot rising from under the floorboards. It was in late October of 1998, somewhere deep in the northern woods of Washington state. The days were getting shorter, and the evenings turned cold fast. I was 28 back then, working as a freelance carpenter who often took small off-grid projects. That fall, a friend of a friend had asked me to help build a small hunting cabin on a patch of land he owned near the edge of the Cascades. It wasn't a real job, more like a quiet escape for a few weeks, a place where I could camp, cut wood, and clear my head while doing something practical. I didn't mind the solitude. I actually preferred it. By the 3rd week of the project, the structure was nearly done. It wasn't much. A single room, wooden frame, tin roof, and a small porch. I'd built it almost entirely alone. I'd drive in with my old pickup from the nearest town, which was about 40 miles away, and stay for a few nights before heading back to restock supplies. There was no power, no running water, no reception. The nearest farmhouse was probably 15 miles down the dirt road that led to the highway. That day, I had been working since morning. I remember the sky had been gray since noon, the kind of gray that warned of rain but never quite delivered. Around 5 p.m., I started hearing low thunder in the distance. The air got heavy and still, and the wind died out completely. I kept nailing boards, wanting to get the roof's edge sealed before the weather turned. But by the time I finished packing my tools, the rain started, slow at first, then sharp, cold, and constant. I decided to stay the night instead of trying to drive back through the muddy roads. I had a small cot inside the cabin, a lantern, a thermos, and enough food for a night. It wasn't the first time I'd slept there, but that night felt different almost immediately. Maybe it was the weather, or maybe it was the way the rain hit the new tin roof. It made the cabin feel smaller, almost suffocating. By the time the sun disappeared, the rain had turned into a downpour. The wind began to pick up, rattling the corners of the unfinished walls. I checked everything, the door latch, the windows, the tools outside, but everything was fine. I set the lantern on the workbench and poured myself some coffee from the thermos. The warmth helped, but I couldn't relax. There was something about the darkness outside. The forest felt alive, like it was pressing up against the cabin from all sides. Around 9 p.m., I heard something, just a faint noise under the sound of the rain. It wasn't thunder or wind. It was dull, steady, and distant. I ignored it at first, thinking it was a tree branch falling somewhere nearby. But then it came again. A thud, then another. It sounded like something heavy being dropped on wet ground. I got up, pulled on my jacket, and stepped outside with the lantern. The rain was cold enough to sting my face. My boots sank into the mud as I moved around the side of the cabin. I could barely see 10 feet ahead. The beam from my lantern cut through the sheets of rain, and everything looked strange, glossy, wet, moving. I stood there, scanning the treeline, but saw nothing. The sound had stopped. The woods were dark, silent except for the storm. I went back inside, dripping and cold, and shut the door tight. I tried to shake it off. Woods make noise. Rain knocks things loose. It wasn't unusual. I wiped the water from my face and checked my watch. It was close to 10. I laid down on the cot, pulled the blanket up, and listened to the rain hammering against the roof. But I didn't sleep. My body wouldn't relax. Every creak of the wood, every gust of wind, made me sit up again. Around midnight, I heard another sound, closer this time. It was a scraping noise, slow and deliberate, like wood dragging on wet dirt. My stomach tightened. It came from the back wall of the cabin, near where I kept my tools. I sat completely still, listening. The scraping went on for a few seconds, then stopped. Then I heard something lighter, footsteps, or what sounded like them, moving around the side of the cabin. I held my breath. The lantern was still lit, casting a dull yellow glow across the walls. I turned it down slightly so the light wouldn't spill out the window cracks. The sound moved again, this time toward the porch. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I slowly reached for the hammer I kept near the cot. I didn't want to open the door, but I couldn't sit there waiting either. I told myself it was probably an animal, maybe a deer or a coyote curious about the light. But it didn't sound like that. The weight of the steps was too heavy. I finally stood up, holding the hammer in one hand and the lantern in the other, and stepped toward the door. The handle was wet from condensation. I hesitated, then pulled it open fast, shining the light across the porch. Nothing, just the rain pouring down, the ground turning to slush. The noise was gone. I stepped outside again, sweeping the light across the clearing. The rain had turned the soil into a slick mess. I walked to the side of the cabin, then to the back, where I thought the noise came from. The beam of the lantern caught something, a small set of muddy footprints leading away from the back wall into the trees. They weren't animal prints. They were boots, human boots. They stopped just a few yards into the woods and vanished where the mud gave way to wet leaves. I followed a few steps before stopping myself. The forest was pitch black beyond the reach of my lantern. I couldn't see or hear anything except the rain and my own breathing. I turned around and walked back to the cabin, locking the door from the inside. I sat there the rest of the night, too wired to lie down. I didn't hear any more sounds, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching. Every shadow looked wrong. Every gust of wind made the walls creak like footsteps. By morning, the rain had slowed to a drizzle. The light coming through the window was pale and gray. When I finally stepped outside, I went straight to the back of the cabin. The footprints were still there, half filled with rainwater. They were large, probably a man's size 11 or 12, and deep, like whoever made them had been carrying something heavy. I followed them again, this time in daylight. They led into the trees, curving around toward the small stream that ran behind the property. About 50 yards in, I found where they ended. The tracks stopped near a large fallen log. The mud around it was disturbed, like someone had been digging or moving something. There was a shallow hole, half filled with rainwater and leaves. Inside it was a small tarp, soaked through and partly buried. I pulled it aside and found a rusty metal box underneath, about the size of a shoebox. I lifted it out. It was heavy. I carried it back to the cabin and opened it on the porch. Inside were a few old photographs, some wrapped in plastic, and a small revolver covered in rust. The photos were black and white, showing what looked like a family standing in front of a cabin. Not this one, but one similar to it, maybe older. On the back of one photo was a date, 1967. I didn't know what to make of it. The box had clearly been there for decades, but the footprints were fresh, made just hours ago. Someone had come out in the storm, dug this up, and then vanished into the woods. That realization hit me hard. Whoever it was hadn't been some random hiker. They knew where to look. Maybe it was their box. Maybe they had buried it there years ago and came back for it. But what made my stomach twist was the thought that they might have seen me building that cabin all week and waited until I was alone to come back for it. I didn't stay to find out. I packed my tools, locked the cabin, and drove out that afternoon while the roads were still passable. I didn't tell anyone about what I found. The box, the photos, the gun. I left them with the local sheriff's office in town and never asked about them again. A few months later, I heard through someone in town that the land had been bought by another man who planned to tear down my cabin and build something bigger. I never went back to see it, but sometimes, when it rains hard at night, I think about that place. The sound of footsteps outside, the footprints in the mud, and how close that stranger must have been to my cabin while I sat inside, wide awake, waiting for the storm to pass. It was late October of 1996 when I decided to take a short break from work and spend a few days alone in a cabin deep in the woods of northern Montana. The cabin had belonged to a man named Harris, an old family friend who used it for hunting before he passed away. It was small, just one bedroom, a narrow kitchen, a sitting area with a fireplace, and a storage shed out back. It sat near the base of a hill, with thick pine trees surrounding it from all sides, blocking most of the sunlight even during the day. I had gone there once before as a kid, but this was the first time I was going to stay there alone. I just wanted some quiet, away from the noise of the town and my job. The drive there took almost 5 hours from Missoula. The last 30 miles were on a rough dirt road that twisted through the forest. By the time I got there, the sun was already sinking behind the trees, and the sky had that orange color that fades too fast in the mountains. The air was cold, sharper than I expected for October. The smell of pine and damp earth hit me the second I stepped out of my truck. There wasn't another house or cabin for miles. It was dead quiet except for the wind moving through the trees and the occasional creak of the cabin's wooden walls as they adjusted to the cooling air. Inside, the cabin was exactly what I remembered, plain, dusty, but solid. The furniture was old but still in good shape. There was a small metal sink, a wood-burning stove, and a stack of firewood in the corner. A few hunting rifles hung on a rack near the door. A single bed was against the wall in the back, covered with a faded quilt that smelled faintly of cedar. I spent the first couple of hours cleaning up, sweeping away dust, lighting a fire in the stove, and unpacking a few supplies. Mostly canned food, coffee, and a lantern. By the time I finished, it was dark outside. The kind of dark that's thicker than anything you get near town. The windows reflected my own face more than anything else. I sat by the stove with a cup of coffee and listened to the wind outside. It sounded like it was pushing through the trees in waves. Every now and then, I heard a soft thump from the roof, probably pine cones or branches falling. It was peaceful in a way, but there was an edge to it. That quiet that feels too quiet. The first night passed without much sleep. I kept waking up to sounds, soft scraping noises from outside, the faint crunch of leaves. Could have been animals, I told myself. Maybe deer or raccoons. Around 3 a.m., I heard what sounded like something brushing against the back wall of the cabin. A slow, steady drag, like someone pulling a stick along the wood. It lasted for maybe 10 seconds, then stopped. I sat there in bed, staring at the ceiling in the dark, holding my breath. Eventually, it went quiet again. I didn't check outside. The next morning, I stepped out to look around. The air was misty and cold, and my breath hung in front of me. The ground behind the cabin was soft from rain, and I saw a few long marks in the mud near the back wall, like something had been dragged there. It wasn't deep, but the lines were uneven, stopping halfway around the side of the cabin. I bent down, touching the dirt. It was damp and cold, no footprints, just those thin lines. I told myself it could have been an animal dragging a branch or something light. Still, it made me uneasy. I spent the day hiking around the area, trying to get my mind off it. The woods were dense, with pine needles covering the ground thick like a carpet. The air smelled fresh but heavy with the scent of wet bark. Around noon, I found an old trail that looked barely used. I followed it for a bit until it faded into a clearing. In the middle of it, there was something odd, a rusted metal drum, half buried in the dirt, with the lid pried open. Inside were scraps of something blackened and old, maybe trash that someone had burned years ago. I didn't touch it. The area felt strange, quiet in a way that wasn't peaceful. By evening, clouds had rolled in. The temperature dropped fast. I gathered extra wood and built up the fire before it got too dark. While I was stacking wood behind the cabin, I noticed something again. The dirt near the back wall was disturbed, more than before. Fresh drag marks, the same kind, leading away toward the trees. This time there was something else, a faint smell. Not strong, but there. A rotting kind of smell like spoiled meat. It was weak, carried by the wind, but it made my stomach twist. That night, I barely slept. Around midnight, I woke up again to a noise, a low scraping sound, right outside the back wall. It wasn't wind. It wasn't branches. It was deliberate, steady, slow. Then it stopped. For a long time, I didn't move. My heart was pounding so loud I could hear it. After maybe 10 minutes of silence, I forced myself to get up. I grabbed the flashlight and one of the rifles off the wall. The beam of light shook slightly in my hand as I moved toward the door. I opened it and stepped outside. The cold hit me hard. My breath came out in white clouds. I walked slowly around to the back, shining the light along the ground. The mud was disturbed again, deeper this time. I followed it a few feet toward the trees, and that's when I saw it. A torn piece of dark fabric half buried in the dirt. I pulled it out with the end of the rifle. It looked like part of a jacket, old and stiff with dried mud, maybe even blood. I froze. My stomach sank. I scanned the woods ahead, shining the light between the trees. The smell was stronger now, a thick, sour stench that made me gag. I followed it only a few more steps before I saw it. Lying partly covered by wet leaves was a body. or what was left of one. It looked like it had been there for weeks. Skin pale, clothes torn, the lower half buried in dirt. I stumbled back, the light shaking in my hand. Took me a few seconds to think straight. I backed away slowly, keeping the light on it. I didn't know who it was or how it got there, but I knew I had to leave. I went back inside, locked the door, and stayed up until daylight, sitting near the fire with the rifle in my lap. Every creak in the cabin made my chest tighten. When the sun came up, I packed everything as fast as I could and loaded it into the truck. The air outside was still cold, but the smell was faint now. I took one last look at the cabin before getting in. It looked the same as when I arrived, quiet, old, harmless, but I knew what was lying just a few yards behind it. The drive back felt endless. The dirt road seemed narrower, the woods pressing in on both sides. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest ranger station, where I told them what I found. They sent a team out there that afternoon. A week later, an officer called me. They confirmed it was a missing hunter from earlier that summer. He must have died out there alone, maybe fell, maybe got lost, and the animals did the rest. They didn't find any signs of foul play, but they said one thing that stuck with me. The cabin was only a few yards from where his camp had been, and from the way the remains were found, it looked like he had tried to crawl back toward it before he died. I haven't gone back to that cabin since. Sometimes I still think about those nights, the dragging sound, the smell, the marks in the dirt. I used to tell myself it was just my imagination or an animal or the wind, but now I know what it was. He had been there all along, not far from the wall, maybe just trying to reach safety before the cold took him. And when I remember that sound, the slow dragging outside the cabin, I realize he probably wasn't far away at all, just trying to move one last time against the wood of the cabin where I slept. It was late October of 2019 when I decided to take a solo trip to a small cabin near the Navajo County border in northern Arizona. I had been working in construction for months without a break, and I wanted silence, real silence, not city noise or the constant buzz of people. I booked the cabin online, a small wooden place tucked at the edge of a pine forest, about 20 miles from the nearest town. The listing said there was no Wi-Fi, no cell service, and the last 5 miles were just dirt road. It sounded perfect at the time. I left early in the morning from Flagstaff, drove for hours on winding roads that grew thinner and lonelier the further I went. The sky that day was a pale blue, washed out, the kind of color that made everything else feel dry and lifeless. The last stretch of road was nothing but uneven gravel with deep grooves from rainwater. Dust rose in heavy clouds behind my truck, and the smell of pine grew stronger the deeper I went into the forest. The cabin was small but sturdy. It sat on a patch of dirt with nothing but trees and a half-collapsed wooden shed off to the right. The front door creaked badly when I opened it, and the first thing I noticed was the smell of old wood and stale air. There was one bedroom, a small kitchen with a wood stove, and a living area with a single worn-out couch facing a stone fireplace. It felt abandoned but not neglected. Someone had been here recently. There were chopped logs outside, stacked neatly, and the ashes in the fireplace weren't completely cold. The first night was peaceful. I made a small fire, cooked canned soup, and sat in silence, listening to the soft crackle of burning wood. I slept early, the air outside colder than I expected, with frost forming on the window glass. Sometime after midnight, I woke up to a faint scratching noise. It wasn't loud, just subtle enough to blend with the creaks of the cabin. I lay still, trying to tell if it was an animal or just the wind rubbing branches against the siding. After a minute, it stopped. The next morning, I found faint marks near the back door, thin lines in the dirt that looked like something had dragged along the wall. I brushed it off, thinking maybe a raccoon or stray dog had wandered close. The rest of the day passed quietly. I hiked a bit, took photos, and gathered wood. Around dusk, I noticed how quickly the forest turned dark here. The light seemed to drain all at once, not gradually. The silence grew thick, like sound itself was being swallowed. That night, the scratching came again, this time from the side window. It was slow, like someone dragging a dull knife against glass. I sat up in bed and listened hard. My breathing was loud in the stillness. After a few seconds, the sound stopped again. I waited, staring into the dark corner of the room, half expecting to hear footsteps, but nothing came. I convinced myself it had to be branches rubbing in the wind. The third day, I decided to check the area around the cabin more carefully. About 30 feet into the trees, I found what looked like animal tracks, but they were strange, almost human, but not quite. They were longer, more narrow, and spaced oddly, like whoever made them had walked unevenly. The hair on my arms stood up when I saw how the tracks circled the cabin, leading from one side to the other. I felt watched, even though I couldn't see anyone. That evening, I made sure to close every window and bolt the doors. I kept my flashlight beside me as I sat by the fire. The wind outside started picking up around 10 p.m., and the trees swayed hard enough to make the cabin groan. Then I heard it again. Not scratching this time, but something heavier, like slow footsteps in the dirt outside the wall. My heart started pounding. I didn't move, barely breathed. The steps stopped near the front porch. I waited, listening so hard my ears began to ring. Then came a low sound. Not an animal growl, not a human noise, but something between the two. It was deep and broken, like a throat trying to shape a sound it didn't understand. I felt cold down my spine, like my body had already decided I was in danger before my mind had caught up. I turned off the lamp and stood completely still, staring at the door. After maybe 10 seconds, the doorknob moved. Just a slow, careful twist. Metal against metal. It didn't turn all the way, just enough to make it click faintly. Then it stopped. I could hear breathing, slow, heavy, just on the other side of the wood. My pulse thudded so hard I thought whoever was there would hear it. I picked up the hatchet I had kept near the fireplace and stayed frozen for what felt like forever. Then, the breathing faded away. I didn't sleep at all that night. When morning came, I opened the door slowly. The dirt outside the porch was disturbed. Clear footprints leading off toward the trees. They weren't animal prints. They were human-shaped but wrong. The toes were too long, the heel marks uneven, like the person had walked barefoot on broken ankles. The ground had faint spots of something dark too. Not enough to be blood, but something had dripped or leaked there. I packed my things that morning, ready to leave, but when I tried to start the truck, it wouldn't turn over. I checked the battery, the cables, everything seemed fine. I even tried to call for help, but of course, there was no signal. I decided to wait until daylight was fully up before walking out to find a spot with service. Around noon, I started the walk. The road was quiet, nothing but the crunch of dirt under my boots. The trees pressed close on both sides, the sun barely cutting through. After half an hour, I realized something strange. There were no sounds at all. No birds, no wind, nothing. Just silence. That same feeling of being watched crept up again. Then, from somewhere deeper in the trees, I saw movement. It was a shape low to the ground, crawling fast between the trunks. I stopped, frozen. My mind told me it was a deer or coyote, but the way it moved didn't fit. It stopped about 50 yards away and stood up. For a second, it looked like a man, tall and thin, with long arms that hung too low. The skin looked pale, almost gray, stretched tight. I didn't wait to see more. I turned and started walking fast, almost running. I didn't look back, but I could hear movement behind me, faint but steady. When I reached the clearing where the cabin stood, I felt a sick twist in my stomach. The door was open. I knew I had locked it. The inside was a mess. The table knocked over, my bag ripped open, food scattered everywhere. The smell in the air was sharp, metallic, like rust or blood. I saw more of those strange prints on the floor, leading from the door toward the bedroom, then back out again. I didn't stay long. I walked the road again, this time not stopping until I reached the paved highway miles later. A truck driver finally pulled over and helped me get to town. When I told him roughly where the cabin was, his face went still. He said that area had been abandoned years ago because of animal problems. He didn't say much else. I went back for my truck 2 days later with a towing service. The cabin was just as I'd left it, except the footprints in the dirt were gone, washed away by rain. The tow driver said it looked like no one had stayed there in months. The strangest part was the door. It was fixed, shut tight, as if it had never been forced open. I didn't tell anyone the full story. I just sold the truck, left Arizona, and never went camping again. But sometimes at night, when the wind outside my apartment rattles the windows, I still hear that slow, dragging sound. And every time I close my eyes, I remember that thin, gray figure standing between the trees, moving like it was wearing someone else's skin. That cabin is still out there somewhere, deep in the forest, but I'll never go back. Some things out there aren't ghosts or myths. They're real, and they watch quietly, waiting for the next fool who wants silence.